Welcome to IRDAX and the Committee on Globalization and Social Change's book launch and discussion of Gary Wilder's Concrete Utopianism, The Politics of Temporality and Solidarity. My name is Herman Bennett, the director of the Institute for Research on the African Diaspora in the Americas and the Caribbean, that is IRDAC, and a faculty member of the Committee on Globalization and Social Change, one of the co-sponsors, and a faculty member in the PhD program in history and the certificate programs in Africana, American Studies, and early modern global studies. So I just want to start with some thank yous. First of all, I want to thank Z. Dempster and Sheehan Moore. Sheehan's right up here, who has just made all of this possible. I just want to say thank you. You've seen the lovely flyer and all the things that are happening over the course of the day and getting you here, as well as the reception in 5109 afterwards. That's all been put together by Sheehan and Z. Dempster. Z is very elusive. She won't, she'll get everything done, but she won't actually be here to take the thank you. Although she just walked in. Thank you, Z. We also want to just be straightforward about this. Thank you, Gary. Thank you for writing this book. Thank you for your engagement. Thank you for bringing us into solidarity and community, into sets of conversations that will be long-lasting. Without that book, we wouldn't be here today. We wouldn't be having some of the conversations going forward that I anticipate that will be happening long after this book is well-worn and dog-eared. IRDAC's mission, very quickly. Our missions focus on supporting and bringing scholarship on the African diaspora to the various publics here at the Graduate Center, CUNY, New York, the nation, and the world. On the basis of the complexity of the African diaspora, we are deeply committed to interdisciplinary inquiry across a range of temporal periods, geographical sites, and thematic interests. Knowledge production troubles the long-established common sense of disciplines, the humanities, and the social sciences. So come on in, folks. There's some seats up here. Just make your way up here. No reason to sit on the floor. The conversation, the talks, and the seminars we have here can and have changed a discursive domain intent on persuading us that there are no other possibilities, no alternatives, no other ways of world making in the past, present, and future. All such talk of possibilities has been and gets characterized, if not dismissed, as utopian, with the intent to dissuade, to disavow, and to denigrate any effort or thinking to denigrate any efforts or thinking to the contrary. This is why we at the Graduate Center and at IRDAC, among other entities represented here, seek out, support, and offer platforms like today's launch for Gary Wilder's Concrete Utopianism, The Politics of Temporality and Solidarity. Format, straightforward. Gary will talk for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then a conversation driven by questions and answers between Gary, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and Manu Goswani will follow. Afterwards, we will open the conversation to you, the audience. Following our conversation, do join us for a reception upstairs in 5109. You guys, Julie needs a seat. Julie needs a seat right up here. Right up here. Okay, there you go. Sorry, Julie. We just love you so much, So let me just introduce the speakers very quickly and not necessarily in the order. And then I want to say one quick other thing. Ruth Wilson Gilmore, a professor in the Graduate Center's PhD program in Geography and certificate program in American Studies, is the director of Center, Place, Culture, and Politics, the former president of the American Studies Association. She has also been recently inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Congratulations. Seriously. A scholar and a revolutionary, Professor Gilmore has been the founder of some of the most important social justice organizations of our time, including Critical Resistance. She is the author, among other critical writings, The Golden Gulag, Prisons, Surplus, Crisis, and Opposition in Globalizing California. More recently, Abolitionist Geography, Essays Towards Liberation, and Change Everything, Racial Capitalism and the Case for Abolition. Manu Goswani, a professor in the Department of History at NYU or at New York University, is a scholar and theorist of modern Indian history who writes and engages the history of economic thought, political economy, and social theory. Among her numerous publications are Producing India, From Colonial Economy to National Space, and most recently, Political Imaginaries in the 20th Century India. Finally, Gary Wilder, a professor in the Graduate Center's PhD program in anthropology, French, and history, is the director and faculty member of the Committee on Globalization and Social Change. His most notable publications include The French Imperial Nation State, Negritude and Colonial Humanism Between the Two World Wars, Freedom Time, Negritude, Decolonization, and the Future of the World, and the book we have come to help launch and celebrate, Concrete Utopianism. Again, the politics of temporality and solidarity. So why IRDAC? I just want to, I'm going to take just a second here as sort of the prerogative as director for why we wanted to sponsor this and why this event really mattered to me and to the outfit that we're part of. In the turbulent 70s, sorry, stay with the mic. Lesson to you guys, right? Stay with the mic. In the turbulent 70s, as a young person, I'm not going to say how young, but early teen. I remember in that turbulent time when folks were struggling to figure out the world, when a lot of us were trying to make sense of the world and the world around us. And one of the places what that meant for me was walking into certain kinds of bookstores, a bookstore that made sense and trying to organize, knowledge or provide knowledge and understandings. And what was really always remarkable about the bookstore I went to was this bookstore in a working class community in Germany, was that the way in which knowledge was organized was that there was a shelf called, or a section or a bookshelf called Economia, or what you might call economy, right? And then there was one on politics, and there was one on theory, and there was another shelf also on third world theorists. And one of the things about Gary's book that it does, and its radical insistence, is that it actually transgresses that radical separation that informed that kind of progressive politics and organizing of knowledge. What it did is that what his work is doing to me, and what it does for IRDAC, is that it puts into conversation Marx and Frederick Douglass, Du Bois, among other thinkers, third world thinkers, so that they're not outside of a kind of framework of our kind of understanding of what constitutes political theoretical thought, right? First thing. The second thing that this work does in really radical ways for a program for IRDAC is that it takes Black thinkers serious, right? The section on third world thought was oftentimes the section on activism, action without necessarily thought, right? And we have to keep in mind, it's only been within the last generation that there's something called Black intellectual thought. Even the organization, the emergence of the Afro-American Intellectual History Society, which has been less than 20 years old, was an intervention into the idea that Black folks, brown folks actually have thought that needs to be seen in conversation, placed in conversation, and taken serious in conversation with radical Marxists, among other thinkers. So to that extent, why this book here, and why this book now? I thank you, Gary Wilder, for putting part of that conversation into play here for us now. Thank you. I'm sorry, there's an intervention coming right here, Gary Wilder.
Fellow globalists wanted to make sure their number one balance on the subject.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah.
This is beautiful.
And this is our representative,
here.
spokesperson from the Committee on Globalization and Social Change, Jesse Schwartz, on behalf of the committee.
Killing me here. Thank you. Thank you, Jesse. Thank you. This is like the old grad center. This is so
Yeah,
great to
it
be
is.
here, right? I mean, they're trying to kill us, but they haven't killed us yet. And we still have this, we still have these folks, we still have this thing. So I am very grateful for that. Thank you so much, Herman, for organizing this. I'll echo your thanks to Z and to Sheehan. And these guys, thank you, Ruthie and Manu. More than anything I've written, the pieces in this book or the thinking in this book was really inflected by conversations in this building, triangulated, of course, with academic debates and things happening in the world. But this is really the book that comes out of these conversations. Friends, colleagues, comrades, it makes all the difference. From the moment I got here, Herman, you were always embodied this idea that this place was more than the departments. Atlantic Studies, Caribbean Epistemologies, Globalization, Iridac, same thing for Place, Culture, and Politics. It's the counter grad center, and it is so exciting and important. And Manu and I have been in conversation since 30 years, I calculated out, since 1992. I think it's 92. And she doesn't like it when I say this, but it is the fucking truth that every single time I sit down to write something, there is a voice in my head that says, will Manu think this is dumb? So, for real, for reals. So as Herman said, since you guys haven't read this book, I'm gonna give, I think it's like 12 and a half minutes. I got comments right now. It's not that long, less than 15 minutes. And then we'll just enter into a conversation about issues I bring up or issues that are in the book that I didn't bring up. And hopefully you guys will start to reverse engineer what it might be about. This is not a summary. There are a lot of moving parts here. I can't even remember most of it. I am not summarizing it. But I will give you a pathway into it. So my thinking in the book starts from a simple starting point. There is only one world, and it's characterized by entanglement, interdependence, and asymmetry. It is a differential unity partly forged through capitalism as a worldwide system of domination. The oneness of our world poses a fundamental challenge for emancipatory politics. On the one hand, such politics must, as ever, be oriented toward collective self-management, grounded in social equality, whose aim is human flourishing. One way or another, this is a local affair concerning specific socio-political communities, however we might define them. But on the other hand, our world historical conjuncture, as we know, is characterized by intersecting global crises: climate change, financial instability, nativist exclusions, war, mass displacement, neo-fascist authoritarianism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Intersecting crises that necessarily inflect, if not obstruct, any project for collective self-management, for human freedom. Emancipatory politics therefore require translocal visions, practices, and forms which call for transversal alignments, identifications, and forms of association that cut across seemingly self-evident boundaries between regions, cultures, ideologies, interests, etc. In other words, if we want a left politics adequate to our times, we need to fashion new ways of relating autonomy and interdependence, democracy and internationalism, singularity and solidarity. So this is the perspective from which I argue throughout the book that we need to pursue projects for fundamental societal transformation based on the conviction that another world is possible. And doing so requires us to pursue another nomos of the world, a different world order, since, as Trotsky warned, socialism in one country is not possible. In other words, internationalism is both a means and aim of emancipatory struggle. I argue that such efforts require political vision or practices of political imagination that refuse both epistemological and political realism. Walter Benjamin calls on us to awaken to the dreamlike quality of waking life under capitalism in order to win the energies of intoxication for the revolution. Ralph Ellison identifies Black invisibility as an affliction and a capacity, like Du Bois's double consciousness, that allows actors to see around corners and hear across epochs in order to seize the moment and turn the tables. This means thinking dialectically, being attuned to how alternative possibilities may already dwell within existing arrangements. But it may also require the paradoxical capacity, as Marx instructed, to draw our revolutionary poetry from the future. Conversely, it may mean recognizing, reactivating, and reworking traces of less alienated forms of life or unrealized possibilities that persist within our non-synchronous now. Michel Levy calls this revolutionary romanticism, and I'm down with it. These operations all of these operations, and they're different, they're not the same, but what links them is a refusal to conflate immediate appearances with the really real. They do not mistake what is given for what might be possible. Each requires us to unthink supposedly self-evident boundaries between here and there, us and them, now and then. In the spirit of Freud's uncanny and Du Bois's double consciousness, this means making the familiar strange and the strange familiar. Recognizing how seemingly stable entities may differ from themselves, but also how seemingly disparate entities may be already entwined. So this is the work of what I call concrete utopianism. Whereas abstract utopianism engages in ungrounded speculation about perfect societies, concrete utopianism identifies plausible links between given arrangements and other possible worlds. It traces actually existing pathways to supposedly impossible outcomes. It makes circumscribed demands that are not implausible under given arrangements, but whose logic and implications, if followed far enough, are incompatible with existing arrangements, might even help to explode the existing order. This, I think, is partly what you might mean by non-reformist reforms, or that's partly how I understand non-reformist reforms. Think here of prison and police abolition, the elimination of fossil fuels, global South debt cancellation, or reparations for Atlantic slavery, and many other examples we can think of. Note my processual emphasis on utopianism. This is not about static plans or ready-made formulas. Concrete utopianism signals an intellectual and practical orientation, a visionary and experimental way of seeing and knowing and doing that is attuned to what under existing arrangements appeared to be or is said to be impossible. I thus link concrete utopianism to Marxian imminent critique, which identifies within a given phenomenon features that point beyond its actually existing form. I also link it to what Aimé Césaire calls poetic knowledge, a way of apprehending the world through concrete images rather than abstract concepts, which helps us to recognize how phenomena may be more or other than they appear to be, precisely because of what they happen to be. Concrete utopianism resonates with what Henri Lefebvre calls the possible impossible. It entails prefigurative practices of anticipation, acting as if the impossible future were already at hand, a calling for that is a calling forth. But here's the paradox. If our world historical conjuncture calls for this kind of political orientation, 50 years of neoliberal counter-revolution converging with 40 to 50 years of a certain kind of influential critical theory has undermined our capacity to even think, let alone act along these lines. Or at least that's the kind of bold and polemical claim I make in the book. So this is the perspective from which I critique what I call left culturalism, presentism, and realism. Left culturalism automatically figures cultural difference as the primary and self-evident axis of political antagonism. It treats cultural singularity as proof of untranslatability, proof that new alignments cannot be forged across immediate differences. Left presentism treats the given order as unsurpassable. It holds that future-oriented political projects requires an outmoded, Eurocentric belief in linear temporality, progressive history, and teleological certainty. Such presentism tends towards melancholic fatalism and metaphysical pessimism. Left realism fetishizes the actual. It treats empirical historical developments as the horizon of political possibility. It dismisses attempts to create other possible worlds as dangerously naive, optimistic, idealist, or even, oddly, elitist. Realists typically deploy utopian and romantic as terms of abuse. Strands of culturalism, presentism, and realism, of course, are typically woven together to form a theoretical orientation and political position that should be familiar to most of us here. We need to wake up or grow up to the fact that societal transformation is unrealistic and impossible, an outmoded relic of past eras. Misguided efforts at solidarity politics will necessarily reproduce cultural or racial divisions and hierarchies. Marxism is simply Eurocentric, the Eurocentric flip side of liberalism, another form of Enlightenment universalism that cannot possibly grasp racial difference, colonial domination, or non-Western historical situations. This position also insists that the self-evident way to confront Eurocentrism or racial and colonial domination is either through a categorical rejection of universalism, as if every universalism is abstract and liberal and every particularism is empowering, or through an uncritical embrace of non-Western epistemologies, as if there exists some categorical outside from which to challenge modern forms of domination. Such thinking, so characteristic of our moment, retreats into what I believe are analytically dubious and politically limited binaries, false choices, like those between universalism and particularism, the West and the global South, and especially statist nationalism and liberal internationalism. Those can't be the only two choices. Such thinking offers us self-identical notions of here, now, and us, provincial notions of place, punctual notions of time, and ontological notions of subjectivity. Such thinking reduces utopianism to idealism, romanticism to conservatism, and Marxism to liberalism. It mistakes poetic vision for prescriptive blueprints and pessimism for radicalism. But I think there's a perverse complicity between such fatalism and neoliberal triumphalism. Both make ungrounded metaphysical assertions about the end of history. I regard liberal optimism and categorical pessimism as two sides of the same anti-political coin. Both leave existing arrangements undisturbed. Ironically, however, the right wing in and beyond the US has indeed pursued a quite successful 50-year hegemonic project that was partly inspired by left-wing counter-systemic movements of the 1960s. The right has employed utopian political imagination in the service of fundamental societal transformation. Reactionary forces have offered powerful visions of a world they wish to see in order to mobilize broad coalitions across evident differences to remake world history. In horrifying ways, we have seen the supposedly impossible become everyday realities. So this is the perspective from which I call for left thinking to pay renewed attention to solidarity and temporality, to critical internationalism and concrete utopianism, to dialectical reversals and aesthetic politics. This is why I am so taken by Lenin's revolutionary call to transform the imperial war into a civil war, which I take to mean that in any given situation, the crucial axes of political division or alignment are not self-evident. They cannot be known a priori, they must be discovered and constructed. This is why I find it so useful to recall Samir Amin's bold, if imperfect, call for a fifth international, or a new internationalism of peoples. This is why I emphasize that the dangers and difficulties of translation practices and solidarity politics should be starting points for what are certainly risky, messy experiments, but they're unavoidable, rather than preemptive reasons to retreat from the challenge. This is why I am so interested in tracing affinities, partly why I'm so interested in tracing affinities and intersections between certain currents of heterodox Marxism and Black radicalism. Maybe my own modest exercise in political translation, a small attempt to forge generative connections across evident differences. This is why I emphasize that these traditions offer us ways of thinking universalism radically in terms of differential unities that depend neither on abstract sameness nor on liberal reconciliation. We might think here of Edward Glison's conception of relation as an open totality, a worldwide network of ramifying singularities. Recall Glison's dream of a world in which we might wander without becoming lost, and his vision of what he calls wandering as the site of assembly. Throughout this book, I engage critically with thinkers whom I hold in high regard, who pose urgent questions and offer persuasive critiques of liberalism. But liberalism is low-hanging fruit, and I often find myself frustrated by their anti-political conclusions. This at a moment when the old warning about an existential choice between socialism or barbarism has never been so stark. And just because the prospect of such an international democratic socialism is so remote does not make the stakes any less high or the struggle any less imperative. On the contrary, Fernando Corneille, one of many spirits we should invoke into this room, absent presences who informed all of us, Fernando reminded us that while the contemporary left has no map, it still has a compass. One way of thinking about this book is a loud and long-winded query about why so much of the academic left has lost the will or capacity to use that compass. Thanks. Okay, let's talk.
Let's talk. All right. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, everybody, for coming out today. Thank you, Herman, for inviting me to participate in this conversation. Thank you, Manu, for being only down the street, but we finally met today after I don't know how many years in the same city on, different intersections of Fifth Avenue. Gary left a copy of this book in my mailbox, maybe the end of last summer.
August, yeah.
August, yeah. And I eagerly picked it up when I got back from my summer away from the United States. And he inscribed it, Ruthie, exclamation point. You can hear how exclamation point is his most normal form of punctuation. More fodder for future conversation with gratitude and friendship, GW. And I love the inscription, and I love that he set us up for a conversation. So when we agreed to do this event, and Herman very carefully said, well, let's have 10 minutes of this and 10 minutes of this and 10 minutes of this. I said, no, we are going to converse. So we will do our best to do that. And your beautiful, not summary polemic about what it is that motivated you to put pen to paper or fingers to keyboard and write this book couldn't be more urgent. And in that, I am in complete agreement with you. And I thought maybe we could start out by talking among ourselves about the kinds of theorists that you've drawn together, mixing those shelves up, as Herman suggested in his introductory remarks, and the kind of what I have come to call conviviality that informs the work that you're doing. And if there's anything that must be true of concrete utopianism, it's conviviality. When I first came across that word as something other than something that elites would say to distinguish their superior being from the rest of us, we are convivial. You are complainers. But when I first came across convivial as a good word, it was actually the anthropologist Jean Lave, who was my dear friend and quite a mentor to me when I first started teaching in a tenure track job 25 years ago at Berkeley. And she said convivial, and I thought, well, you're not being a snotty elite. What do you mean? And I thought about it, and she actually showed me by how she created the conditions for the kind of conversation that we're having here and that we have had in our various centers and configurations here at the GC over the years, sharing work and sharing ideas and duking it out in a way that enabled us to direct what I've come to call our creative aggression, in toward, what the compass is pointing us to. So let's talk a little bit about these theorists. I mean, I know you have a particular interest in Samir Amin's work, as do I, and others. How do we see this coming together in a way that is generative for us to think theory as, to think social theory as action, but kind of more importantly, to think how theory is a guide to action, and also seeing actions guided by something we can then understand as theory. So there is this kind of doubling effect. And also how when we're perhaps not managing to conjure a convivial provisional commons, then what we're doing anyway, and I think this is a fair take on your work, is that we're tending militantly in that direction, but as a practical program of poaching, which is the other thing that we're all supposed to be doing. And that's a term I got from Stuart Hall years ago. So maybe we could sort of start out talking about this a little bit. Friends, comrades.
Great. I just want to say it's great to be here and thank you for the invitation. And I share that sense of absent presences of Fernando Coronil, but also the work of Neil Smith, and somebody that I was reading deeply and madly in graduate school, Lefebvre and David Harvey and all of that, right? So for me, this represents, so it's always great to be at CUNY and also to be here to discuss this work in particular. So the first thing, obvious thing, to say is that that this work, as somebody who is whose salary comes from a history department, this is a work of intellectual history, but would not be recognized as intellectual history, which remains one of the most protected arenas of sort of surplus, right? Symbolic and intellectual surplus. And with all the kind of associated gatekeeping and methodological nationalism, and also this a kind of virtuoso intertextual skirmishing at the expense of the contextual stakes.
With no normative stakes, exactly.
Yeah.
No politics at all.
No politics, either as horizon or hope or whatever, yeah. So I think that's really something that needs to be said first off, right? And what it does is the book puts intellectual history and social theory, which you might find in political theory departments or in some quarters of sociology, it puts them all together. And in some ways, it is, among other things, a kind of reconsideration, in particular of 20th century, right? Of the notion of politics and the political in the 20th century, when, if you will, a variety of concrete utopianisms were envisioned, imagined, variously enacted, and I think you're very right to point to those particular conjunctures, the interwar moment in particular, the kind of post-Lenin moment, the post-Bolshevik revolution, which for among other things, what it does is that it takes. It irreversibly extroverts Marxism out, right? It no longer belongs to Europe, I think, after Lenin, in ways that's immensely liberating and enlarging, right? And in some ways, because it's forced into thinking actual non-synchronous contradictions. And you see that from Fanon to C.L.R. James to a whole range of figures and the like. So one of the most kind of, for example, there's a chapter in this work which begins by talking about Adorno's lectures on negative universality, and then 4 paragraphs later, we're talking about Samir Amin, right? That juxtaposition, let me assure you, is disciplined and punished normally. Right.
Yeah.
And yet, in that, there is a kind of showing of what a federated theoretical tradition might look like, right? Which is right, and also, even if it's implicit, a kind of deconstruction of this term, which comes from the Cold War, and it's so kind of not particularly useful, but like Western Marxism, and this idea that, you know, they had the training in German philosophy, and these guys were economistic and developmentalist, wanted to talk about, I don't know, village agrarian production, you know, right? And there's a kind of classism and racism and all of that, and a kind of negative link to that division of labor, and that's why. And I think that beginning does all of that kind of work. So I just wanted to give an example because I know many of you have not had the chance to read the work as yet. There's another thing that I want to sort of talk about very briefly, which is the revisiting of the great, wonderful figure of Henri Lefebvre, particularly the impossible possible from his several volumes on the critique of everyday life and the very different moments in which they are written, etc. And so they are mobilized here, as Gary suggested, against the kind of acquiescence to the present, which has been, at least in my field, sort of taken over these kind of meta-historical judgments, often with these.
How are you defining your field? Right.
Where I get my salary from.
Oh,
Yeah.
Because there are other
Variable capital,
disciplining.
where I get my salary. So history, right? And that's where a lot of these, often in these very eschatological connotations of a kind of what you call a left presentism, or there's a kind of climate catastrophism as well. And reading that, if you will, your pushback, to use good organizational terms, against that was, it was therapeutic, because there's such an onslaught of that presentism, not here. This is how I imagine.
Here at the grad center.
Here at the grad center, right? But elsewhere, there is. And so one of the things that I thought it might be interesting, I wanted to ask you, as somebody who is nominally in anthropology. So one of the things I've always thought about anthropology, nominally, well, right?
My salary.
Yeah, your salary.
Back to salary.
Right, back to salary, right? What else are disciplines for? But was the idea that what links left culturalism and left presentism, and you said neoliberalism, and I was thinking in some ways perhaps it's even more specific yet deeper. It's a kind of the common neoclassical economic common sense, and that is the deep scaffolding against which, only against which somebody like Samir Amin and all of those kind of world system theorists become intelligible, and they were a kind of concrete internationalism during the Cold War, and from Africa to Latin America, and an ensemble that also included women, which is truly shocking, right? And the like, but they were trained out of and massively disidentified with the discipline of economics, right? And this was so I was thinking about the ways in which that kind of that everyday common sense, or the common sense of everyday life in the last 30, 40 years. And insofar as it has been linked to a kind of absolute reign of neoclassical economics.
And it has suffused critical theory as well.
It has suffused critical
100%.
theory.
Can I say something about the convivial? I think conviviality might be on my dating profile. The word, the word may be in there.
Well,
but
then people should Tinder Gary.
no, conviviality is something that you named a term that is close to the heart. But I love this idea of political and intellectual conviviality. I spend more time talking about translation, but in that last chapter, I come around to the care, love, conviviality. No, this stuff is radical. I was in Pomona a couple of weeks ago and did a book event, and the beautiful Fadi Bardawil was the interlocutor, and he pointed out that he's like, I'm coming around to this question about theory and politics. He said, most of the thinkers you like in here seem to be independent and not academics, and most of the ones, not all, and most of the ones you criticize are academic thinkers, and maybe there's something to that. So I'll put that on the table. The other thing to say is this idea of poaching. There's a kind of it's not just this attempt to statically link a kind of Black critical tradition and a Marxist tradition, but there's something certainly about the particular constellation of Black critical thinkers I curate or select or constellate in this book. They share many political orientations, but one of the things they share is this hunger for critical resources and possibilities and leverage everywhere, in all practices, in all cultural traditions, in all kinds of texts. And I think that also is very different than this moment. Of course, I am down to decolonize disciplines and syllabus, etc. But so many of the people here were not interested in what should we stop reading, but how do we read all of these things differently, and not just to kind of against the group, like we need to know the enemy, but how can, there may, and this is this business of like, we don't know where the alignments might be, or transform the imperial war into a civil war, that there may be, Fanon finds something in the psychoanalytic tradition, and James finds something in Melville, and Glieson finds something in Faulkner, and I think there's something, there are political and convivial possibilities, generative convivial possibilities for a different way of thinking and being together in that notion of the relationship between theory and practice.
That's my entire point. And I want to clarify for the audience, if not for Gary, that when I say convivial, I am not talking about care and lovey-dovey. I'm talking about living together, which is what the revolution is for, right? Am I right?
100%.
Okay, all right.
100%.
I just want that to be
Yes,
clear. Nobody
yes.
go out of here saying, "Oh, she said convivial."
No.
She means sharing
That's
cupcakes.
I go to love in the last chapter. Political love.
But I'm trying to say it's not the last chapter. It's the whole book. It's the whole book.
I'm glad that came through.
All right.
Back to the neoclassical economics, though. You know much more about that than I do, but I am stunned again and again how, over and over, an understandable critique of the limits, the Eurocentric and analytic and limits of a certain kind of Marxism, and even blind spots in Marx, lead to a kind of taking Marx and Marxism off the table in a way that leaves untouched all these neoclassical economic assumptions in so much of our thinking. But anti-capitalism isn't taken off the table. So much of what I read, there's a critique of, capitalist this, capitalist that, but kind of in either refusal, again, not in this building, refusal, or an inability to actually, if capitalism, it can't just be a qualifier. If it's part of the problem you're talking about, then you need in some ways to engage with what capitalism is and what capitalism does. But this kind of preemptive dismissal or critique of capitalism leaves, it just becomes a kind of signaling device of like capitalism is bad but we've already told ourselves that we can't use any of the tools that have been developed. And Marxism isn't the only set of tools. It's a powerful set of tools. There are many, but I'm struck it's not that everyone needs to be a Marxist, but the kind of we've been reading climate stuff all year, and Herman and I have been going back and forth about that, and so much of it is like extractive capitalism or fossil fuel capitalism, but then so much of what we're reading actually has no way of even engaging what that is, and I think we need to.
I think that one of the problems, among the many problems that we face now, is that too much of our, and I'm including everyone, including in this building, our intellectual labor has crystallized in the form of complaint. And complaint has its purposes, but it's not the end of theoretical intervention. And if it is, then it's just words, which is to say recitation of facts and harms and conditions of catastrophe without any notion of how those things might be, how do I put it? Oh, you're teaching Gramsci this semester. How those things might be renovated and made critical, right? And so one of the distinctions that I've been working with for a while and that I find, really generative and in encountering Gary's work and listening to what Manu has said in these last few minutes that we've been together is thinking the difference between recitation, which is what this complaint stuff is, or even the enumeration of details of facts and problems about climate or anything else, and rehearsal, which is doing, right? So my definition of abolition, so you can all have it, is life in rehearsal. So what Gary's written for us is a book of intellectual life in rehearsal, in which the elements for understanding the thought of one thinker, let's say Adorno, not my favorite guy, but if he's your guy, he's your guy.
He's one of my guys.
Doesn't happen without understanding or trying to come to some understanding of the thinking of Ellison or somebody else, that together we construct a model for change, which is not a blueprint and is certainly not a script. Right. So this is a Brechtian way of thinking and doing, which I know you're very amenable to doing together.
One more bit about this, I love that, rehearsal for intellectual life and rehearsal. I mean, one of the things I try to do here is not just line up. I mean, sometimes I thought, okay, the whole point of this COVID fever dream of a book was just an opportunity to quote favorite people, it's just a quotation delivery device, for sure. And I have people I love, and if nothing else, I want people to read it and say like, shit, I gotta read that and reread that and look at that and I thought I knew that. And if I do that, that's good enough. But I also wanted to kind of not just line up people. I was deliberate about bringing unlikely people who have affinities, but also people who have really important differences, and saying like, well, let's still put them together at the table. So for example, Glieson is not the kind of, he doesn't in some, he doesn't line up politically from top to bottom. Neither does Samir Amin in any way, but there's a way in which we Marxists, anti-capitalists, whatever, anti-imperialists may have more to learn from a Glieson than someone who is more obviously giving the message we want, as ways of thinking. And I tried to, bring together a lot of people who I find where we can make aspects of their insights critical, even if they're not there, which I've done that in my work a lot, which has led a lot of people to misunderstand my work. That my last book, I tried to do that, and there was such a misunderstanding that my buddy Matt, who's here, said, "Oh," when I was telling him about this book, he's like, "Oh, people, you're writing about the politics of the last thing. Like now you're just saying it. Like you're just saying you're giving the theory and method and politics of what you've been doing all along. You might just have to say it, you know." So anyway, but I think I don't know what you guys think of that. Of sometimes spending a lot of time with people who, in all kinds of ways, are not my guy, but who like, I can't get away from that. There's so much good stuff there to run with. Do you do that in your stuff?
Or social movements or projects.
Yes, for example.
Because I think, I mean, this is where
the energy is.
Yeah, and this is where I wanted to perhaps sort of raise a question. Gramsci was a curious absence in this work, and I'm not going to say it was symptomatic.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah, because I thought. Yeah, just in terms of thinking about politics as a kind of node, as a, in terms of possibility, in terms of the long, hard slog of making unlikely alliances that's required for a politics of solidarity or a politics of the impossible possible. And because this question of uneven development, or in the most expansive sense, was so central, right? I mean, there's this, and his and just the fact that, and just from his physical disability to his Sardinian super otherness, whatever, all of that, right? So there was so that
he will figure prominently in the next one.
Yes,
on,
okay.
on
Yes,
James.
yes,
I mean, it's
I
not
knew-
for
I'm
nothing
sure
that I'm
that
teaching
was
him
coming.
right now. But like the waters were too deep.
Yeah.
There was Gramsci at an earlier iteration, and then I was like, this is its own. Yeah. So I mean, yeah, of course, yes. Yeah. I wanted to do, I was like, I was getting frustrated with the citational use of Gramsci, and I realized I needed and wanted to kind of take it on in a more, take him on or use him or sit with him in the way I sat with, going forward, like the way Glieson shows up as an unlikely hero running through this. No one more surprised than me in a certain way. I think, that's where Gramsci will be there.
Yeah, no, I mean, it wasn't an argument. I mean, it wasn't
No,
a point
criticism.
about.
Yeah, I got it.
But I mean,
But he
is
belongs
summoned.
at the table.
He's summoned, right, in the way that you bring up Stuart
Hall,
Hall,
yeah.
right, and that great moving right show, and then and you think, well, if Stuart Hall's idea that that it's a counter-revolution without a revolution, then that's another way into thinking against that kind of melancholic presentism of the Enzo Traverso, right? Because they're not saying there was it's a counter-revolution without a revolution. In other words, social democracy was not the revolution, right? Whereas
Crucial to remember.
yes, kind of crucial to remember. I mean, but I just think that those are so kind of horizons are so easily forgotten or overlooked. Yeah.
Something else that came to mind, Glison's, massive presence in your book compels me to say this. Among artists, Glieson is like in everything, all the time, everywhere.
Yeah.
You cannot
I've seen
escape Glieson
those wall
if
texts.
you pay attention to either whether it's the words or when people talk about their art. And now I have not been throughout the entire planet in every possible artist convening, but I have noticed, quite strikingly how in an internationalist configuration, Glieson is really present. And that's of interest to me.
What do you make of that?
I think that people who imagine their art has political meaning, even if they can't say what it is, are looking for ways to talk about that without kind of signing on to a particular ideological framework. and that the poetic of relation allows that, the right to opacity
Right.
totally
Oh,
allows
yeah, for
that,
sure.
et cetera. And, and there was a bit of recitation there as well that might or might not, mean something more thought beneath, but there's so much everywhere.
I've encountered the backlash against that.
Mhm.
I've encountered people who are all that wall text and all those exhibition framings and all that art glissant talk. I've encountered a lot of eye rolling, like enough already. And I'm like, but there's so much more in glissant too. I mean, there's,
of course.
it's poetic. There are depths. It just keeps going and going. And that's one of the things I like about it. I guess that's one of the things. All these people I read, even Adorno, he's messed up, but they all these people, the ones, the team, Team Gary in here, the ones I really like, their work that like, it's not message, it's like, it's stuff that just, that warrants rereading, or not just because it's so hard and I haven't gotten it yet, but it's like, it just keeps living with me in different ways. And Glieson is one of those people. So I resist that kind of, I've encountered, I don't know if and you guys have, I've encountered some of that, like enough Glieson, who isn't, it's like, well, I don't know. I feel like I'm just at the tip of understanding bits of him. So.
Well, and I think some of that backlash, the enough Glieson backlash, and I bet
Like
that,
it's banal if it's
our buddy Fred Moten will, there'll be some enough Fred Moten someday.
Right.
And 30 years ago, I encountered enough Stuart Hall.
Yeah.
Right? So, anybody can get the enough anvil dropped on their head. But,
I should be so lucky to have the enough anvil dropped on her head.
And that is that part of the problem that goes through arts, humanities, social sciences, and beyond has to do with the problem and allure of novelty. And when the novelty wears off, which is say the fashion is no longer chic, then people can say enough of the mock turtleneck, where's your cleavage, or whatever it is that people are looking for.
Enough Samir Amin. I mean, really, that whole like, oh, we're done with that. And
There never was any.
right, well, I didn't get any Samir Amin in graduate school because that whole generation that taught us was like, world systems is Eurocentric, only goes in one direction. It doesn't, there are many problems with world systems theory, and he wasn't even, but that whole global political economy was off the table. We were studying imperialism, colonialism. You read it, I came later, but it was not there. So I think that's part of, Benjamin's recently outmoded is so exciting in that way. Or maybe just recent, leave Benjamin out, just the recently outmoded. Or it's one of my methods, is always looking for the kind of what we think we know and moving beyond the kind of inherited one line, or the inherited ways people are taken up to just signal a certain position. And then you go in, it's like, oh, this is a planet, this is a world.
So I want to use this as an opportunity to invite some conversations, and so that we can come back to
More convivial?
Yeah. So I want to, yeah. You want to grab one of those mics? If folks want to throw out a question, that gives our guests and our speakers a chance to also engage with you, and then we can come back to this part of the conversation. So, but you do have to raise your hand, and the mic has to be brought to you. The mic has to be brought to you because otherwise the people online can't hear you.
I have 50 more questions, so you all better
We can keep
jump.
going.
If you want to get in, jump. We are talkative people up here.
We can collect stuff too,
Yeah,
and maybe
sure.
Yeah,
it will
let's
resonate.
get a
I want to hear your question.
So we're going to take a couple of questions though.
Okay, so I think everybody's in agreement. We live in a neoliberal world, which is one of the things you take on in various ways. But we also live in a very religious world, which would be very surprising to some of these social theorists from 100 years ago. And there's many unholy alliances between various forms various different religions, between fundamentalism and various forms of authoritarianism. So how does, if we're going to be post-secular humanist, how does various spiritual practices or religious movements, pertain to what you're doing?
I'll take a few more.
Sure.
Hi, thank you. Benjamin came up a few times. To me, he's where I discovered the intervention in homogeneous empty time, possibilities of shaping the way that your social change works within time. I wanted to know how you work with Benjamin, and also what temporality means in your book. I'm really curious. Thank you.
You guys answer that one.
Hi, yeah, I've actually gotten through the first 80 pages of your book, and so I'm here. I've always been very interested in what is imminent. Had a graduate student who just wrote on the in imminent in the political, and so I'm just wondering if you can just speak more about imminence in politics, or in the politics that is to come, or how we identify a politics to come.
Okay, Shan, that's it. No, let's hold on to those three and then let Gary give a chance, and then the speakers. You guys should feel
Okay.
free to
Okay.
engage this.
Okay,
through
yeah,
the
it doesn't
text.
have to be just
Yeah.
me. Just to be clear, I keep mentioning conviviality because Ruthie just like hit a chord deep inside me. Conviviality means a lot to me. Personally, politically, socially, ethically, as a way of being, for sure. Okay, religion. Look, big topic. I don't know what a post-secular humanist is, but I will say that like all of these things we're talking about, we can't decide ahead of time. There may be religious practices, communities, forms of association and conviviality that are enormously productive, that are non-commodified, that might be based in mutuality and reciprocity. And there may be, there are all kinds of empowering and emancipatory religious traditions and practices and communities and refuges, and deeply reactionary ones. So I'm not, necessarily interested in coming down one way or another. Benjamin, he's, an ongoing interlocutor. There's so many things that interest me about Benjamin. I wouldn't really know where to start. But certainly in this book, part of what I pick up on or hone in on is this attention to poetic politics on the one hand, that, those two lines I read, winning the energy of intoxication for the revolution. There's a way in which Benjamin brings together, we typically think about Benjamin as bringing together the messianic and the Marxist, and he certainly does that in all kinds of ways. But I guess here I'm very interested in the way in which he's bringing together a kind of avant-garde tradition, an aesthetic, an attunement to uncanniness, to the surreal face of the real world, with something like, he wasn't a practitioner of movement politics, but he was a believer in movement politics. Brecht was also in his ear. He had many people in his ear. So partly, I think that aspect of Benjamin is extremely interesting to me, the way in which he works out this idea that it's not transgression for transgression's sake, but there's something about the disruptive practice and experience of aesthetics and forms of transgressive practices and experiences that need to be reincorporated into political practices and political life, not only as a means of disrupting the given order, but as, again, the kind of world we want to live in, the kind of less alienated life we would like to live. That's part of it. And of course, there's all the temporal stuff. Here, I'll just talk about the awakening. I think this business of awakening, which is a way, a kind of a kind of experience, but also a disposition that cuts across the self-evident opposition or boundary between sleeping and waking. And there's something about that kind of space that is, again, might open a pathway to the kind of otherwise so many of us talk about, but may also prefigure, it's a rehearsal for that kind of otherwise. That part of the political project is to create more spaces like that, to expand those possibilities in everyday life, and to create conditions for more people in more places, so that that intersection, that deeply human way of being is more possible for more people in more ways. There's so much to say about Benjamin, but I don't want to monologue. I can say more, but I'll just end here with the kind of temporality again. Temporality and imminence. So much to say about temporality in the book. I guess, I mean, there are four, it's on every page, and I should be prepared for this question. I guess one of the things I talk about in one of the chapters is that it's useful that, couple things, that if part of the task here is to rethink politics, and if politics always presupposes a certain diagram about history and time, or politics, history and time, or implicit notions of history and temporality, then rethinking politics means rethinking time and temporality in all kinds of ways. And that's part of the kind of gambit of or kind of what's guiding me all the way through. And without getting into the specific ways in which I try to do that or pay attention to beloved interlocutors who do so, is this insistence that there is, or suggestion that there is, a dialectical relationship between social formations and temporal frameworks, and that certain kinds of society presuppose and produce certain kinds of time, and certain kinds of time presuppose and produce certain kinds of social practices. So as social analysts and as political actors trying to analyze the conjuncture and think about what to do, whether we need to pay attention to the temporal aspect of what we are doing. Imminence, one of the things I'm interested in is the way in which, this here, there, now, them, us, them business is about insisting at every step that what appears to us is not self-identical. It's internally contradictory, and that's that kind of Marxian or being attuned. Maybe not every, I don't want to make a kind of once and for all metaphysical claim about everything, always, every situation, every person, every text, but I'm always looking for the ways in which the given is not identical with itself. And once something is not identical with itself, including a temporal period, right? A given now is not temporally self-identical. It's cross-cut with emerging futures, with persisting pasts. That's part of this temporal stuff. So I'm taking both questions. So I'm extremely interested in imminent critique because it's the poaching thing. It looks within the given for possibilities that may allow for rehearsals of that something else. And that's what I mean by imminence. Of course, if we're thinking about societal transformation, about revolution, about, it's embarrassing. What does revolution even mean? But of course, in this tradition, imminence, we shouldn't get, by saying that we have to get to the next place by moving through what's given, is not to say all we have is what's imminent and we only have the given. There's a fine line between those two. So I always think about, Marxism or Messianic Marxism as a kind of imminent transcendence. We're always looking for that transcendent moment, but the transcendence isn't coming from a comet or God or Hegel's spirit or reason or something like that from outside. It's us, doing our messy stuff now. So that's how imminence interests me. One of the things I do here, though, and I would love to hear both of you guys who are deep readers of Marx and Marxism, is I was struck, and it was kind of preliminary, but I was struck for so many years. It's like dialectical reversal, imminent critique, the given. And then I was really struck in here, as you saw in the book, by that one line where Marx famously says we need to draw poetry from the future. and also by this dialectic of past and future, you know, the Russian commune stuff, in the Grundrisse, all the former social formations that carry through, and that even Marx himself was always interested in immanent critique, but also that, you know, we need a Marxism that allows for these three modalities, for looking at the given contradictions within the given that may move us to the next place, but we also need, in a Marxian way, to draw our poetry from the future, concrete way, not just in a speculative way, but also to look for the ways in which within our given world, you know, either past possibilities or you know, non-commodified forms of being together, of conviviality, may persist and be available to us. And so often within Marxism, it's just that first move. And I think all three of them are consistent with my Marxism, or my Marxists.
Yeah.
Well, certainly that exchange with Vera Zasulich
Yeah.
about the mirror, but these are arguments that others have also put forth. Obviously, Kristen Ross's work
Harry,
on
yeah.
the commune about how that
Tomba.
redistributes, and Marx Tumba's, that the experience of the commune, it redistributes Marx's sense of the possible, that there is a kind of significant shift that's registered in that Vera Zasulich exchange, which, you know, was a huge thing for whoever among us was reading the Journal of Peasant Studies in the 1990s. Its translations, the mirror. But that is precisely the energies of the so-called outmoded or the anachronistic. And this is in a way what I was going to just, you know, anthropologists have been so much more attuned to that dimension, or that has been more the work of critical anthropology than historians, right? To describe that, to render that vivid, and, you know, and then I was thinking of that great tradition in anthropology, figures like Saarland and Graeber, right?
The Graeber move.
Operation. Telling us about the bullshit jobs as the temporality of the present, or debt, or in debt. These are common, so I mean, it seems to me that's something that, yes.
Yeah. May I add?
Yeah, please.
May I add before
please.
we go to another round?
I asked.
I'm a geographer. So that means that I have to sort of start from the given that there is no time without space, and that the emplotment as the narrative ordering of time and emplotment as the geometric ordering of space is something we have to think together all the time, right? All the time, all the time, all the time. And that within that, however, there isn't like a singular, I'm going to cite you, there is no singular rationality of power, as Herman writes in his great book, African Kings and Black Slaves. There is no singular one. So that means that even thinking those emplotments, you know, even in this room, would give us, if we notice well, and if we have good, you know, theoretical guides, multiplicities, you know, in this, you know, within these four walls. So that said, one of the challenges that Gary presents to us, that I urge us all to take really seriously, is the challenge of thinking what, you used the word tradition about 45 minutes ago, but thinking the tradition in the sense that Raymond Williams teaches us to think tradition, which is the selection and reselection of ancestors. And that a tradition is an accumulation of structures of feeling. And then we already know, because so many smart people have thought about this, that an era doesn't have a singular structure of feeling, there are many, and those are contradictory. And we think of contradiction, as Gary was just describing so well, as co-constitutive interdependencies, right? My words, his thought. And so then what we're finding our way toward are history's protagonists over and over and over again. And that means that, crucially, from the ground up, what we should, I think, understand to be happening is that history's protagonists are making the world, and sometimes we can see it and sometimes we can't. That our job as professional intellectuals, and we are, you're a student or faculty or a professional intellectual, we get, a paycheck or a crappy stipend, right? It makes no difference, is to sort of help in the revealing, right? Help in the revealing, and whether or not we agree to go down a route of messianic anything, which I'm not altogether sure I can. Certainly, what's happening here, and what I really thank Gary for helping us think about, is how the world as it is and the world as it's becoming, is something that has a lot of plasticity, and that's being modeled and remodeled as against a kind of very late 19th, early 20th century modernist conception of how sculpture should be made, which is, say, carved out of a rock. That there's one form that is heavily weighted in the rock and temporally waiting in the rock that we will find. And kind of letting go of that is, I think, essential to our capacity, well, as beings in the world, but certainly as thinkers about the world, to see the various kinds of plasticities that are actually in play. So that just to wind this up, what I think we're doing is trying to not only uncover, but also to make the historical geography of the future. Right? So there is no future without space as well as time.
Take a few more. There's some questions there.
So I know we broached temporality and began to speak about it, but I was thinking about, and I'm glad that you're a geographer, I'm an environmental psychologist, I hear you. Julia Kristeva, and I was thinking about temporality with, overlays of questions of gender. I was thinking about how you referenced that this was your pandemic book, right? That you were writing during the peak of think time, but it was also a time when you could not tune out other voices. And there was a lot of boy talk in the original portion of our time together here today. Boy talk meaning thought. And I wonder what you did, or where you bring in temporality with the other voices, with the thinking of like Julia Kristeva, et cetera. So.
Hi, thank you so much for this event. I wanted to ask about Glieson as the sort of unlikely hero of this book, and more specifically sort of how you're thinking about poetics in relation to questions of solidarity. You mentioned it in an answer earlier about Benjamin. I've taken sort of an interest in my own dissertation as I hopefully come to a close with that, in the question of poetics in the early years of the Bolshevik sort of post-revolution, the adequation of form to content, the relationship between aesthetics and politics. And I guess I'd just like to hear more sort of about poetics as a concept that you're working with throughout this book.
Take one more.
Sure.
So thank you for this book, Gary. The other day, I was trying to help my 12-year-old daughter bake a cake, and we laid out the stuff for this baking of the cake. And I said, you can put any of this stuff in it except the salt. Now, is there any salt for you?
Yeah.
Can we add anything to your concrete utopianism?
Okay, I could say a little bit. I don't talk about Kristeva in this book, but I'd love to hear the reference on what Kristeva you would invite me to think with and read and engage or reread. It's been a while, but one of the amazing things is you write things and then you open a book for another seminar or something you're teaching. You're like, this was in here 25 years ago? Oh my God, I'm so embarrassed. Like, you know, the reinventing the wheel stuff, which is different from, yeah, it's just age, exactly. But certainly, I have a, you might appreciate the, one of the chapters begins with I think a longish a decent number of pages to Octavia Butler's Kindred, which is a way into thinking about repetition and haunting, kind of reminding us that a lot of the excited scholarship about haunting in the last X years was so taken by a mode of thinking against abstract homogeneous time that haunting itself or specters or spirits were just understood in a Derridian sense as good, as better, as transgressive and progressive. And I think there can be, you know, hauntings that create openings and hauntings that are deeply painful, that are linked to unfinished business. But of course, all hauntings create openings for, you know, it's a different way. Haunting is another mode of imminence that, you know, there's an unsettledness, a non-identicality to the thing that is not going to be resolved unless, you know, that can't be resolved within the given order. So I'd offer that up.
You can also say Avery Gordon
Avery Gordon.
out loud.
Avery Gordon.
Thank you.
I do also cite and talk about Avery Gordon and her book, remarkable and amazing book about unfinished business and haunting. It's great. It's in there, but
Yeah.
H. Glieson and poetics. Again, there's so much. I'll just say two things briefly, which is that I think Glison's poetics of relation is really in many ways a politics. You know, he constantly talks about the way in which a poetic sensibility, a different kind of way of apprehending the world opens up a different way of relating to each other in the world. So I'm interested in the way in which his poetics of relation suggests a politics of conviviality, a politics of transversal, you know, both wandering and being together. And one of the amazing things about Glisson is, you know, that time and place thing. He's always linking. I mean, he's the most hyper-local, situated, concrete thinker who's thinking about Martinique, about a certain geography, about the landscape, about that history and that place, and how that place is unthinkable apart from the world, and how that place is present all over the world. So he's constantly, that dialectic of place and world is so interesting. That's an aside. That's not about the poetics thing. But the other, you know, I'm interested in poetics as a way into politics and thinking this being together otherwise. But the other one, not the other, another issue that I take up here is the way in which Glisson confronts the dilemma of how to produce a history of a place like Martinique, where history has been the medium of domination for so long, both worldly practices and a conception of capital H history and the historiography. But he doesn't just leave the field and say, I will write poetry or philosophy because history is impossible. But he says the way to get at this history is through for example, through fiction, through novels. And the kind of, one of the amazing things about Glieson is that he is a genre buster. I mean, not only in the sense that his own work is at once history and philosophy and poetry and social theory, but he shows us that one has to get at one of those, one has to go through the pathway of the other, that the best social theory might come from through poetry, and the best history might be through fiction, and that they're indeterminate, and we need to be in this kind of a kind of an open dialectic. And that's, I mean, his idea of the totality of the open totality is part of this, that as opposed to adding things together or synthesizing or lining them up to create some kind of straight line, he puts them in relation to each other. I mean, it is an ethico-political concept in such a deep way, puts them in relation to each other so that each kind of interrupts and completes the other. And it's not that, it's not an aporia, it's not an impasse, it's not about, aha, you see, this undecidable means that you can't go there because you're here and you can't go. It's actually the way in which they kind of interrupt and fuel and displace and derail. It has a propulsive movement to it. And I think, politically, ethically, theoretically, that's, I'm down with that. I think that's extremely useful. So that's quick riff on poetics, but. Salt. Oh, salt. Dude, there's plenty of salt in here. There's so much, I mean, it's almost, I don't know what, I mean, look, one of the things Samir Amin does, one of the things I forgot in his, it's tricky, the organization of convergence without, difference without, anyway, the organization of his vision of internationalism. One of the things he does is he struggles with this. He says, look, we need a deeply inclusive internationalism of peoples, but the moment we suspend political judgment, this project will stop. So he puts political judgment on the table without apology. And so I think that there's something, I'm really taken by that. I think we do need political judgment. And although I cringe at my own criticisms or getting carried away with myself here, or my own frustrations, and I just have to have these exclamation points, you'll see in the book, there's a lot of that. But, suckered, what a weird word, reassured by this idea that we need political judgment, and I'm exercising political judgment, and you can disagree. And I think judgment with, non-dogmatic, there's a difference, I think, between orthodoxy and dogmatisms and party lines and the suspension of judgment. I mean, liberal inclusion is not the game here. It definitely is about politicizing lines of opposition. My concern is that the lines of oppositions, those axes of division that we've inherited, are not necessarily the most important ones in this or that situation, or the only ones. There may be other ones, but I'm all about constructing those lines of alignment and division, which I take to be the salt. So this is not the more the merrier. I mean, in a certain way, when you're talking about internationalism, cosmopolitanism, solidarity, you're definitely talking about the more the merrier, but there's a war. We're at war right now, so.
What I meant by that question is, if your purpose is, as in any cake, to make it sweet, you cannot add salt.
Well, yes, you can. You have to put salt in a sweet thing to make the sweetness bloom in your mouth.
Ah, beautiful. Ask Tomba, those Italians, the savory sweet, the salty caramel.
I've never made that kind of cake.
Dialectical reversals.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm sorry if I misunderstood you. I thought you were talking are there deal breakers? And I'm saying, yes, there are deal breakers.
Yeah. Well, I think it's still, are there deal breakers? But I was thinking too about the question my comrade here in the second row raised by raising the specter of boy talk. And that's a real thing. And the two things came to mind, which were on my list of many questions to ask. One is, what audience are you trying to constitute for this book? You talk about the left and you complain about the left, and I agree with you in the complaints about the left, but there are 8 billion people on this planet. Most of the globe's Marxists are not white, they're probably not men, and they're definitely not in the global north. So if we're talking about Marxism, then we're already not talking about the usual suspects.
For sure.
And yet the usual suspects seem to come to mind when we talk, or actually literally come to mind. So somebody like Lefebvre, who I admire, comes to mind. So that's one thing. The second thing related to that has to do with double consciousness that you talked about very eloquently, and the necessity, I think, of becoming alien to ourselves. And that you talked about being able to see around corners, This is all important. And it's also how it is that we, can concoct this cake with a good pinch of salt that makes the sweet surprising and the cake, part of what we need for life, which salt, as you know, is. And the third thing that is related to this, and it's really at the heart of contemporary efforts for radical revolutionary internationalism to flourish. They already exist. They exist. People are doing things. I visit people, I talk to them, I write about them. Nobody reads it. Abolition Geography. It's a book, not abolitionist, abolition. That all of this is happening, is constantly unfolding, but without political judgment. What happens is people establish collectively, convivially, and even sometimes with structures and institutions that we call the state, ways of being together. And then those things can be run over, evacuated, destroyed in such a way that it seems as though this is the inevitable outcome of dreaming of a borderless world, right? So we've got, this central contradiction of, I don't know, for want of a better term, sovereignty and borderlessness. So these are some of the things that come to mind that I think, relate to the question about salt.
Let me say something about audience. When I started writing this, my language was looser in the sense of talking about the left. And as I got into it, it became very clear. And I hope there's probably slippage all through the book, but I hope it's clear, and I'm clear, that it is a critique of the academic left in the North. And I was going to say before, when Manu said this about Marxism after 1917, 1914, I remember very clearly in 2014 when we did that post-colonial contemporary symposium, and you were part of that, and you commented, you started, and this has resonated ever since, your first words were, wait, because it was this whole Marxism, post-colonialism nonsense, this is not an either or thing, was our gathering that day. And you said, it has never been the case that the majority of Marxists in the world are white. So, when has that been the case, or something along those lines? So I take that seriously, and that's part of what I'm doing here. It's not big on examples. This wasn't the example book. This wasn't that kind of work. Although I keep pointing to the fact, as you both said, this left internationalism never stopped. It never stopped. It's not a new thing, but somehow the academic left, or these now there's it begs the question of, like, who gives a shit about the academic left? Why would we care? And yet, so to the extent that we are professional academics and we have this task, I felt moved to kind of put language to a certain kind of frustration that does echo in so many places. But I am also struck by the fact that outside of academic spaces, so much of this is embarrassingly common sense, is these passionate calls are just like where people start and what people know and what I learned from people, for example, I've organized with. So that's the audience. The audience is the academic. The audience is, kind of advanced graduate students and young scholars who are being shamed out of, reading this or thinking about that or disciplined in, in this way or that way. It's like to give permission in a certain way. And if, I'm very safe, so I can say things. So why not? But I don't know that it matters at all that there's a book about what's, and yet we live in this world and this stuff matters, and our students and, are constantly moving out and ramifying in amazing ways. So I don't know. It's a bigger question. Does what we do matter at all? Once in a while, I think it might. Most of the time, it is a joy and I can't do anything else. So I don't know.
So I'll take some more questions and then
But yes, to becoming alien to ourselves also. This uncanniness in here, I think that is definitely, that spirit goes through the entire thing, including the Paul Gilroy and Achille at the end, and that being alien to ourselves as a kind of disposition and commitment is and that opens in ways that open possibility. Not that everyone should be, there are certain people who are crushed by alienation in a different kind of way. Sorry, I'm not saying everyone must be alien to themselves at all moments, but as a kind of anyway, there's that line I love where Benjamin quotes. So I use Benjamin also for translation, where he quotes and he says, look, the problem is not that, the problem is that he uses the example of Hindi and German, that these Germans are trying to understand Hindi in German, but that we need to, the German translators of Hindi need to understand their own selves, their German language, their society in Hindi. And as a shorthand way, I think that's consistent with this idea of becoming alien to ourselves productively.
Right. And it's also, really central to what it means to be an actor. That every actor is necessarily becoming alien to themselves, which doesn't mean they're killing themselves,
right,
or destroying. This is what it is.
Well, in these solidarity practices, sorry.
Yeah,
I was just going to say, like in these practices, transversal practices, solidarity, internationalism, whatever, we tend to think that it's only a matter of pre-constituted groups or identities that, like, how do they come together? And of course, that is part of it, and that's a difficult thing. But of course, in the coming together, newness is constant, new subjectivities, and I think that's part of the spirit of what you're saying. That's the plasticity. It's on every level, the plasticity. And in those experimental, difficult, painful, kind of will always burn themselves out, failed, whatever, coming together is something new, newness. There's always the possibility that new thing that is a kind of productive becoming alien to yourself or aspects of yourself.
All right, I'm aware of the time, and so I want to just say that we can take this conversation upstairs. I want to thank our speakers, the participants, and I want to thank Gary Wilder for everything. And so just keep in mind, for those of you there, in order to shape further questions and to shape the future conversation, there are books on sale. The books are available outside, I believe. And so as you make your way upstairs to come and grab something to eat and drink, make sure you grab a copy of the book. I believe that Gary might be willing to sign your copy, so he's going to make himself available. We'll see you guys upstairs at 5109.
One last thing. I want to thank Tom Lay, my editor at Fordham Press, who's just fucking awesome, so good. Publish with Fordham, reach out to Tom, he's a good man. He's a really good guy yeah, he's a good guy.
That was wonderful what you said at the end about becoming alien to yourself. It just seemed like such an important point of departure for thinking internationalism, right? Don't have any, I mean, it just seems, yeah, really